All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and get started with our work session on Montgomery College's FY20 capital budget and amendments to the FY19 through 24 capital improvement program. We're joined by the president of Montgomery College, Dr. Darian Pollard, as well as Donna Shana from who's our interim senior vice president for administrative and fiscal services, Christina Schramp. Who's the capital budget analyst from Montgomery College. We also have with us from OMB, Rich Harris, as well as Jennifer Bryant, and that's our Office of Management and Budget. I'll turn it over to Mr. Howard to walk us through the salient points, but let me just say that, again, as we find ourselves constrained, and the council president knows this all too well in her role as chair of government operations and fiscal policy, we do have, and we've talked about this quite extensively in our education budget forums, Dr. Pollard, about the limitations that Montgomery County has when it comes to capacity in our capital budget, making sure that we can balance between what happens with our borrowing via our bond capacity, but then also understanding that the debt service that we pay on that bond capacity is incredibly challenging, and we've always been trying to reduce that. That being said, we appreciate the flexibility that the college has continued to provide in terms of understanding that we can't always move forward with every single project in an expedient manner like we would like to, but certainly there are ones that rise to the top when it comes to priority that we want to make sure continue to be on schedule, if not to whatever means we can accelerate. And so we'll go through a number of these different projects that you have and talk about them in greater detail. I will just share with my colleagues that at our education budget forums, there was a loud voice for the thanks to the council. And so I just want to extend that to my colleagues as well for maintaining the Catherine and Isaiah Leggett Math and Science Center at Tacoma Park. Students have expressed how much this means to them and how this is going to make such a big difference. And even for the students who won't be there, but who are experiencing it now, they're talking about what their colleagues who come behind them will be able to experience. And so it really is a great moment for us when it comes to delivering on this campus that's had to deal with some very challenging set of circumstances in terms of these aged buildings for quite some time. So we appreciate your flexibility and working with us and working with the community of Tacoma Park and really being able to figure out the best way to move forward. We know that this is going to be a great building that's going to do great things for so many in our community, and so we look forward to continue to be a valued partner with you on that. At this point, I'll turn it over to Mr. Howard to walk us through the packet.
Great, so we'll kind of do an overview of the college's request and the executive's recommendation, talk about generally about the affordability restrictions, considerations from the executive and how the college proposes to deal with those, and then we'll walk through each individual project that has been proposed for amendment for an initial committee decision. These decisions will go to the full council, and then for final budget reconciliation, CIP reconciliation in May will be the final decisions for all of these. So at the bottom of page 1, we have a table that shows the college's request and the executive's recommendation. The key numbers here are really the last line of the table, which shows that the executive's recommendation is $25.9 million below the college's request. The executive's initial recommendation in January was 24.4. It was $24.4 million reduction, and then the executive included an additional $1.5 million reduction as part of his March 15th operating budget. So this table is a cumulative of both the January and the March recommendations. And you can see the differences by year, and when the committee discusses different projects and we try to reconcile these numbers, we have to reconcile both the total amount and then the totals by year. On page 2, I have a summary of some of the key highlights of the college's request. I won't go through that because we'll be talking about each of those projects in detail. But the summary of the executive's recommended reductions, I do want to note that the college and the executive did work together before his initial January CIP budget to find $3.6 million in reductions that the college has already agreed to take. So we'll talk about those as we go through the projects. But then the executive included an affordability reconciliation PDF, which includes a dollar amount, but it does not identify specific projects. The January number was $7.75 million, and then the increase in March of $1.5 million puts the total at $9.25 million. So section B, the table here shows the affordability reconciliation PDF and the $9.25 million reduction. And it also breaks it down by funding source and year. And this combines both the initial January reduction and the March reduction. You can see that $6.975 million of this is from GO bonds, and $2.275 is from current revenue. So again, we need to keep those funding sources and years in mind as we try to balance the different their college's requests with the executive's recommendation. In the January reduction, in response to the January reduction, the college did provide council staff with a proposed set of non-recommended reductions to meet this cut. The college is recommending that the entire $7.75 million, be taken from the Planned Life Cycle Asset Replacement, or PLAR project. And the table on the top of page 3 shows how those reductions would come by year, and we'll go through that project in more detail in just a minute, but that's kind of globally how they're recommending dealing with that initial January reduction. As in the past years, the college is providing these non-recommended reductions as needed for the council's review and reconciliation process, but they are requesting restoration of these cuts in the final reconciliation process as funding allows. Since the college did not receive the executive's additional reduction of $1.5 million in FY20 current revenue until March 15th, it was not included in this initial set of reductions that they provided. And so council staff recommends just generally talking about this reduction, but reviewing it in more detail as part of the committee's April 12th work session on the college's operating budget, as the current revenue competes with operating dollars anyways. I do want to note 2 more things. One, for the college's non-recommended reductions to work by funding source, there does need to be some modifications in other projects, and we'll go through those in detail as we talk through the projects. And then also that the executive's stated reason for including the additional reduction was the reduced income tax revenue as part of the February distribution. So any questions on the affordability generally before we go into project by project? No? Okay. So at section C, beginning on page 3, the first project is college-wide road and parking lot repairs and replacements, and the project does exactly that, provides for funding to repair roads and parking lots. The college originally requested an additional $500,000 in spending authority for this project. It is not funded with county revenue. It's funded via student fees from the college's Transportation Facility Capital Projects Fund. After reviewing this in more detail, the college determined that the additional funding would not be available in that fund, and so they requested that the executive delete the amount from this project, which he did as part of his recommendations, and council staff recommends approval of that same reduction as requested by the college.
Is there any objection to those reductions? Hearing none, all right.
The second project is the college-wide physical education renovation project, and it funds the renovation of the physical education buildings on the college's 3 campuses, as well as turf to support the college's athletic programs and Title IX improvements. The college requests an additional appropriation of $2.0 million for this project in FY20. Again, no county funds are requested, as this is funded as well via student fees from the Major Facilities Capital Projects Fund, and the county executive recommends approval, as does council staff.
Any objections to this recommendation? Hearing none, move forward.
Then on the top of page 4, I have 2 projects listed together, the Rockville Parking Garage and the Germantown Observation Drive reconstruction. These are both projects that are at or near completion, and in discussions with the executive, the college identified unencumbered fund balances that they weren't going to need anymore for these projects that could be transferred and used to help fund the rest of the CIP. So it's a reduction of $186,000 from the Germantown Observation Drive and a reduction of $900,000 from the Rockville Parking Garage project, and council staff recommends approval.
Any objection? No? All right.
Okay, so those were the real easy ones. Now we get into slightly more complicated projects. Project number 5 on page 4 is the college-wide central plant and distribution systems. This is a new project to provide for the design and construction of new and as well as renovating and expanding existing HVAC units on the college's 3 campuses. Previously, this work was funded through the PLAR project, but the college created a new project in part because they're taking advantage of a new state grant program that provides some funding for this every other year. So the college's request was for $4.875 million over the 6-year period, $875,000 in FY20, and then level funding of $1 million in each of the years thereafter. The executive actually increased, his recommendation increases the amount of funding for that project by doing 2 things. First, he eliminated $500,000 in GO bond funding for FY20, and the college did offer this reduction as part of the discussions with the executive prior to his CIP being released. And then the executive also assumed additional state aid of $500,000 per year in FY21 and 23 because the college does anticipate getting additional funding from this grant from the state every other year. There are a couple further recommended modifications that the college has brought up. The first is to increase the FY20 state aid to $475,000 because they received notification from the Higher Education Commission that they'll receive more funding than anticipated, so that's a good thing. And then the other technical modification is to move the $500,000 in assumed state aid to FY22 and FY24 because they would be getting the funding every other year, so it just kind of moves those to the correct years. So staff recommends the executive's reduction in the FY20 GO bond funding and the additional state aid modifications as identified by the college.
Are there any questions or objections to staff recommendation? If not, we'll accept that. All right.
Okay, project number 6 is the college-wide library renovations project. And this project was new last year in the CIP, and it's intended to fund the renovation of libraries on all 3 campuses in their existing facilities, not the creation of new library buildings. The committee spent a lot of time discussing this project last year as part of the work sessions. And in the end, because of funding constraints, we were able to include some funding for this project, but not very much, and most of it was moved into the beyond 6-year time frame of the CIP. The college's request was to move the $14.1 million that were outside of the 6-year CIP back in to kind of the funding schedule that they had originally proposed last year. The executive recommends reverting the funding and expenditures back to the previously approved levels, and he noted that the requested change did not meet the biannual CIP amendment criteria. Typically, when the council and the executive consider amendments to a CIP project in the off year, it has to impact the year, that second year of the project, and there was no change initially requested by the college for FY20, so therefore it wouldn't meet kind of our typical amendment criteria. And so his recommendation was to move that $14.1 million back out as previously approved. Additionally, the executive, in working with the college, recommends moving $400,000 from FY20 to FY21 to address affordability concerns. Ironically, I think this does make the project eligible for amendment because now the FY20 funding is affected. Regardless, because of affordability, council staff recommends approval of the executive's reductions of maintaining this project at the previously approved level with the addition of that shift of $400,000 to FY21 as offered up by the college. And I do want to note that college staff has indicated that they do intend to revisit this project in preparation for the next full CIP cycle, including the issue of potentially requesting state aid.
Yep, I'm going to turn to Council President Navarro, and I know that our lead for libraries, Council Member Jawando, may want to have something to say as well. Council President Navarro.
Thank you. So, so to clarify, so the proposal is to shift the $400,000 from FY20 to FY21. Is that the main change?
That would be the main change, yes.
And that $400,000 was to be used for what specifically? Planning and design.
Yes, initial planning and design for kind of, I don't know if it's for one library in particular.
Well, the reason I raised that is because, I mean, I do think that there is an interesting, for me, special component regarding this issue of the libraries, given who the student population is and the role the libraries play, which goes beyond just going there, to just study, but I mean, it provides a larger, I think, accommodation for students who may not have, particular spaces in their homes, or, it just really serves as a, I think, multi-purpose, if you will, space. And I've heard from some previous Montgomery College students that happen to work for me that they can attest to the fact that when they were there, already the state of these libraries were subpar. And so I mean, I don't know what the impact is of the $400,000, because at the end of the day, it's not really that much. And if it helps to start, pushing forward this process, I just don't know why we wouldn't leave it there and then during reconciliation figuring out. I mean, I understand it's the very beginning stages, but planning and design, it's nice to have that out of the way before you get into some more substantive.
Yeah, I'd let the college talk about the substance of what it might mean. From a technical perspective, when you look at where the additional dollars were programmed in the CIP, it wasn't until really FY24 that significant dollars would be available. So I think from that perspective, having the planning dollars in FY20 or FY21, based on that schedule, wouldn't make a huge difference in terms of when something would actually come online.
Right, which is why I'm asking. I mean, if it's negligible and it doesn't make a difference, fine. I mean, I assume that if it was there for a reason. So just trying to get some sense of, there are particular projects that have come through in other areas where leaving the money, keeping the money there for planning and design is important, because then it's part of this, ongoing process, so it gets you to where you want to go quicker. And so I'm just trying to gauge whether this is one of those instances, because $400,000, in my opinion, is not that, it's money, but it's not that large of a chunk of money that we wouldn't be able to find. So that's just what I'm just trying to discern.
Certainly, and I'll ask my colleagues to chime in if I speak or kick me under the table. First of all, I want to affirm the first part of what you said about the potency of libraries for community college students in particular. We know for many of our students, this is the only place they have to study. Many of them don't have access to resources at home. They're able to do that in our libraries. In fact, during our finals week, we keep our libraries open until the middle of the night, because students need to be able to have that space. So I really want to confirm that. They say it over and over again. One of the things that's important too is to have momentum with these projects. When we initially proposed it, we had one project with all 3 libraries. One of the things that we recognized last year when working with the committee is that, is there a way for us to stagger those projects in a way that will allow us to meet the needs? So our initial thought had been, if we could do Tacoma Park, we're getting ready to invest in some significant construction there. It is the library that is in most need in terms of redesign and then move into our Germantown campus. And then, as you indicated, Craig, to be able to seek state dollars for our Rockville library, which is the largest and would be the most expensive library to be able to do, so we can have those matching dollars. So we're certainly open and would like to be able to have that momentum in there, and also be able to start doing the planning and design, because libraries, while they have a lot of seemingly easy parts to it to create study spaces, weight distribution and all the things that would happen will allow us to be able to start that planning. Sorry, you want to say anything else?
Well, I just wanted to point out,
Thank you.
I just wanted to point out that the design funding, for Tacoma Park Silver Spring Resource Center is in FY21, but the construction and the furniture and equipment would be about $4.5 million, and that's not showing up here, and that would be in FY22. So, that's the only thing I wanted to point out was, like, the total cost is $4.9 million.
Okay. I mean, so I would just move that the committee consider just leaving that money there because of the momentum issue, and it is not a humongous amount, but I think it does make a difference in terms of keeping that project, alive and kind of going. That's something I would like to propose to the committee.
I'm going to actually turn to our council lead for libraries, Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great to see everybody. So the moving it to 21, FY21, you still have it, you said $4.9 million in 22.
4.5.
Yeah, that's okay.
4.5 million in FY 2022. And that'll be for the construction and the furniture and equipment.
So my question would just be, I guess this is a combination between you and Craig. It would seem like, is that year before, so the county executive's recommendation to move it to the 400 in 2021, would that give you enough time to, it seems like you guys were kind of acquiescing to it, and would it mess us up? You know, I'd like to, my first reconciliation, I want much as there as we can get. But I don't want to, if to the council president's point, if it is going to hamper from doing what you need to do and being on schedule, then yes, we should think about moving it. But if you could tell me that no, we'll be just fine under that schedule and it won't hamper us, then I would probably say, why don't we keep it? So I'm kind of unclear. I know you don't want to turn away money, but just give me and then Craig, if you, after they respond to that, if you could say anything, if you have any thoughts on that.
Definitely.
We're okay with shifting it from 20 to 21. Basically, we did it because we wanted to make capacity for the Tacoma Park Silver Spring Math and Science Building because we had a 4% escalation increase for that project. So we were kind of bringing a solution because we're increasing our capital budget and we're kind of making room in that year to fund that.
Right. Okay.
So.
Okay. And then again, I'm a newbie on reconciliation. I know there's a limited pot, right, at some point, and so I could go either way, but in light of that, how big of an impact, you know, will this have in the broader scope of things?
Right. When you look at the current approved line of the way that the funding is now, the construction costs wouldn't be funded until FY24, that $4.7 million. So if that stays that same way, then I don't, in my opinion, moving the $400,000 to FY21 would not have a huge impact on the project, other than, as Council President mentioned, the momentum and those issues. So in terms of the current project schedule, I don't think it would impact when something could be completed. But certainly I understand the rationale.
And then what is it? So what does it restrict? I guess let me be more clear with my question. So if we move that over, what is the flexibility we have for some other? How does it hurt us? How does it take things away from us that we're able to do in other places?
If you moved it back to FY20,
Right.
That would mean that in FY20, in terms of geo bonds, we'd be $400,000 short, and so we'd have to figure out a way to make that up. That could come from a different college project, or it could come from a CIP project in MCPS or the county government or
Okay,
park
that's
and
what I
planning.
understand. Okay.
What happens is that Dr. Orland takes a look. There's a big difference between looking at $400,000 versus looking at $8 million, right?
Sure.
Because there are issues sometimes of money that's available because the project perhaps is delayed a little bit. So there are ways. It doesn't mean it's not a guarantee, but definitely for $400,000, there's always room to take a look and see if that can be accommodated. It's when we get into the big numbers that it becomes much more of an issue. So anyway, so that's why I still think that it would be better to leave it so that things can continue to move forward, given that it is not a really large amount. It can easily be found, hopefully. That's why it's reconciliation. It doesn't mean it's a guarantee, but hopefully, you can take a look.
Well, I'm not going to, as lead for libraries, I'm not going to slow down a library project, so I'm happy to go. I just want to understand, so thank you.
Let me just share with my colleagues that in my conversations with Montgomery College, this splitting of projects, the 47 or 4.7 encompasses one project, or is that the totality of it's Tacoma Park,
Yes.
right? And so from that perspective, and then the beyond 6 years are the other two projects, or at least, the other two projects right now, with the potential of one of those maybe being paid for by the state if we could get Rockville partially to pay for. My concern with actually bumping that 400,000 into FY21, we are going to have a full look at the CIP next year. And so from that perspective, there may be room for us as we look at what happens at the state level when it comes to CIP funding. This county executive has been forecasting quite a bit in terms of what we're going to get when it comes to his budgetary projections for a lot of decisions he's making. And so I'm going to do a bit of forecasting on my own and say that I think that we're going to have school construction dollars that come out of the state. The state has been very expedient at passing some of that legislation. In fact, it's actually started to eclipse what we're seeing in operating dollars that are coming, and so that seems to be moving faster than the current commission bill. And so from that perspective, may actually give us a little bit of flexibility in our CIP, in which we might be able to accelerate the Tacoma Park Library project. And so having that $400 of planning, $400,000 already programmed in and done would actually encourage us to be able to move forward with this project if we have the space there. And so I think it sets us up for an opportunity to be able to seize and run with a project that's well needed. So I think that it positions us better to be able to be nimble if in fact we do get additional resources from the state. And so I would certainly agree with the council president's motion. I think that, again, it's not going to hurt us. We're talking about $400,000 here, so it's a small amount, but it actually can set us up to be very successful in seizing an opportunity that's there for additional money coming from the state.
That makes a lot of sense. But then you just have to take it and use it, plan it, and we'll be hopeful that we get that we get more that we get more money. Yeah, so I would concur with that.
All right, so I hear unanimous 3-0 in terms of keeping it in fiscal year 20.
So that means that that project would actually stay as it's currently approved, is the recommendation of the committee. Okay. All right, moving on page 6, project number 7 is the Planned Life Cycle Asset Replacement, or PLAR project, which we mentioned earlier. And this provides for a comprehensive life cycle renewal and replacement program to protect the investment in college facilities and equipment and to meet current safety and environmental requirements. I did want to note that the college did not request an amendment to this project. The executive did recommend reducing FY20 funding by $1 million to address affordability concerns, and that was as part of the negotiations and discussions with the college, so they were okay with that. But then they did submit the non-recommended reductions, which would all come to the PLAR project. So in meeting that $7.7 million affordability reconciliation, plus adding the additional $1 million the executive had already recommended, the total reduction would be $8.7 million over the 6-year period. I do want to note that the new HVAC project, which used to be included in here, does include $1 million of funding in the out years. So it's not as big of a reduction as it might otherwise be. At the same time, I know the college was hoping to have that $1 million as an addition, not not supplanting some of the dollars that had been in the PLAR project. And the reason, as is described in the third paragraph here, is that the college does have a large backlog of deferred maintenance. They note that the current approved CIP funding will cover only about 44% of total deferred maintenance costs. And so as a result, further decreases in the project will lower that number. This is similar news to what we talk about each year with the school system and their kind of backlog of deferred maintenance projects. So given the college's non-recommended reductions that they all be included for this project, council staff does recommend approval of those along with their priority order for restoration that they submitted if funds are available, as well as accepting the executive's $1 million reduction that was included in his recommendations that the college is okay with. And also, if you do accept these reductions, it will require technical changes in the planning, design, and construction project, which we'll talk about next.
So this is one that gives me angst, and every year that we do this with MCPS, it gives me the same angst, because what we're talking about is basically not changing the oil and not changing the brakes and changing the tires and just hoping that the car is going to continue to run just fine. And it could. But it certainly ends up being a recipe for disaster in some instances where we're continuing to allow facilities to deteriorate. And these are facilities that are supposed to be top-notch and keeping up with all of our other higher ed institutions throughout the country. So this isn't something that's easy, just as it isn't within MCPS. It's the same exact conversation. I'm always cautious when it comes to making these kinds of decisions. I'd much rather see us front load some of that money and be more cautious in FY20 again, and backloading some of that to some of the out years, understanding that, again, those are things that we'll have to see with Dr. Orland's magic, but ones in which will at least keep us on track for some of those things in the current, understanding that we may get some relief from the state that's coming about. And let me just make one more comment, if I may, about that, because it's very interesting. You know, the assumed money that we get is specifically designed to address these kinds of issues. It's not designed to do something else. We're not supplanting money and putting it in place of something else that was supposed to be there in terms of priority. This is exactly matched for what it's supposed to be doing. And so that's why I feel comfortable about talking about this and saying we can use state money to help us, because they're directly aligned with the exact focus and intent of what they were meant to do, right? We went to the state and said, we have crumbling buildings and we have all these kinds of things. We need you to help us. And the state says, okay, here's some money. You know, it's very different if we're talking about different kinds of things. So here we're talking about the exact same thing, which is why I think that we may want to stick with, and Mr. Howard, help me if you can, you know, so we'd be looking at $154 million that we'd have to find somewhere else. I'd even like to split the difference in 21, maybe get us to 25 or 2.5 in that case, and then spread the rest amongst 22 and 23. So you'd be looking at an additional 469 plus the 154, and then the rest. You know, you spread that over the FY 22 and 23. So if my colleagues are following, go ahead, say it again.
So just make sure I'm clear on this. On the for FY21, you'd like that number to be 2.5 million
Yes, exactly.
instead of
Instead of the
2.031.
2.031, exactly.
And then you would like to add back that $154,000
Correct.
reduction in FY20?
Correct. And so that differential is the 154 plus the 469, correct? If my math is right. So we'd be looking at 623 that we need to spread between FY 22 and 23. So again, this isn't an increase for my colleagues. This is just a shifting. I know, again, this is subject to Dr. Orland and his magic, but keeping those years on track a little bit more may actually help us to stave off any major problems that we may have.
I think, is he doing the math?
Yeah,
Are you doing the
I'm just
math?
gonna, while you guys talking, I'm just gonna make sure I have the numbers
Right.
correct, so I can state this back.
Ms. Schramm or Dr. Pollard, any comments on that in terms of your thoughts and what you may be able to do with that additional revenue?
Well, certainly, I think the only thing I would offer, first of all, I appreciate the thought process, because what we end up doing in several years is coming back with crisis, because as you described, we have facilities that end up needing significant adjustments, and we don't have the resources for them. So if we can stay ahead of that, this allows us to at least have less of a deferred maintenance issue by being able to support this. So I certainly know that my team has the ability to use that money and then some.
Councilmember Jawando?
I was just going to ask about the scope and the scale of the deferred maintenance issues in and of themselves, and just so people, you know, I'd like to say the millions watching at home can understand what the need is. You know, I've been to Tacoma Park. I've seen, you know, obviously we're taking down that building, thank goodness, and we're going to get you, you know, something that is not from the dark ages. But what's the scale and scope of other systems, and why would something like this be necessary?
Brace yourself.
Well, over the next 10 years, it's about $152 million. Roofing, just as part of that, for all the buildings on all 3 of our campuses, is about 12 million. And then we have the new central plan and distribution system project. That'll probably be an additional, that is included in the 152 million, and that's about 10 million. So a lot of our systems are, becoming beyond their useful life, and we're doing Band-Aids to kind of fix it. But, the more you defer it, the bigger problem that you have to deal with later, and it's more costly. So it's, this is really great to, get this additional funding so we'll definitely use it.
Elevators,
Oh,
Ulysses,
yeah.
Thank you. No, that's helpful. I just think we gotta keep
windows.
don't lose the forest for the trees and understand there's big time need.
No, I think that's a great point, and I think one of the other things that we need to consider is we as a county continue to push ourselves to a more greener goal when it comes to energy efficiency. These are things that are gaping holes for us, right? That happen in our county buildings, in our schools. These are the kinds of things where if we're to get to those laudable and lofty goals that we're trying to achieve, can't be done with the outdated HVAC systems, can't be done with roofs that continue to leak and windows that continue to fail. It's the reason why in this very building, we talked about energy cost savings that happen from us renovating a couple floors. I mean, these are the things that truly are also a part of our sustainable goals that we talk about as a community that we want to hold businesses to, right? But we're not doing them for our own institutions within county government. And so I think that that's something at some point where we have to say to ourselves, how are we demanding to, businesses to convert their office buildings and make sure that they're achieving this green sustainability, and we're not even providing for HVAC systems that we know are antiquated and just leaching energy into the air. So, Mr. Howard.
And we'll actually talk about energy conservation in just a minute. But so, what I'm hearing the committee recommendation would be.
Well, it's just, and the chair really doesn't.
Right.
Yes.
The potential recommendation of the committee, as proposed by the chair, would be for FY20 would be $3 million in FY20, which is an increase of $154,000. In FY21, it would be $2.5 million, which is an increase of $469,000. And then that total increase of $623,000 from those 2 years would be split, the corresponding decrease in FY22 and FY23. So a decrease in FY22 of $312,000 would make that number $1.719 million, and then a decrease of $311,000 in FY23 would make that number $1.860 million. And FY24 would stay as is listed in the packet. 2.171.
And my thought, colleagues, is that then when we address the full CIP at the next year, we can look at those out years and see, in fact, and we can also make adjustments in FY20, FY21 at that case, in that point as well. So we'll have that flexibility that's there.
Yep.
Any objection to that?
No.
All right.
Okay, so the next project on project number 8 is planning, design, and construction. And this includes a couple different components. First, the college did request an increase of $550,000 for this project over the 6-year period, with $54,000 in FY20. And that FY20 request is to reflect the 3% salary increase college employees received in FY19. As you know, the council's typical approach for funding salary increases in the CIP is to do it the following year, even though the college actually pays the salary increase in the year that it occurs. The college did note that appropriation requests for this project have been lower than the total annual salary and benefits costs in the project for the last several years. For example, in FY20, the total requested appropriation is $1.85 million, but the total salary and benefit costs paid out of the project is $2.07 million. And the reason they've been able to do this is in years past, they were able to transfer unused project balances into this project to provide them a little cushion, so we didn't have like large spikes in this project. However, in the past few years, both the council and the executive have used those balances, those unneeded balances, to kind of help fund other priorities in the CIP, so there hasn't been the additional funding to do that. The table on page 7 kind of shows the college's projection under the current approved amount and their request of how the dollars would play out. So they anticipate the carryover funds would run out by the end of FY21. So their request is to kind of provide another small increase to this project. It still only buys us time through the end of FY22, but their goal in doing that is to prevent like a huge shock to the system and instead do smaller increases. So that's their request. Then the other component of it is in conjunction with changes made in the PLAR program would be to do a shift of some of the GEO bonds and current revenue dollars in terms of the funding source. So at page 6, at the table at the bottom, you can see the distribution of GEO bonds and current revenue for the dollar amounts is different in the MC non-recommended reduction section compared to the MC request section. So the dollar amount isn't changing from what they're requesting. We're just shifting the funding source a little bit. Typically, the practice is to fund this project at 50-50 GEO bonds and current revenue. In some years, like last year, the council did make some slight alterations to that 50-50 split to meet affordability needs. So what we would do is increase the GEO bond funds for the project by $127,000 in FY20, 23, and 24, and by $197,000 in 21 and 22, and make corresponding current revenue reductions by the same amounts in the same years. I will note I will have to go back and double check to make sure some of those ratios don't need to be altered based on the changes that you just recommended for the PLAR project. But we'll have to look at that and we can bring that back to the committee if there is a change that needs to be made. But for right now, I would recommend approving the college's request and including this shift in funding source as identified on page 6.
Mr. Harris.
Yeah, I just wanted to, well, for the record, Richard Harris, the Office of Management and Budget. I just wanted to make sure that in doing that change that it doesn't throw off what the bonds are eligible to be used for. I don't think that was very clear. I just want to make sure that the positions that would then be covered by going further from the 50-50 ratio are eligible to be bond funded. It looks like that might be the case based on something that a project in MCPS, but just want to make sure that's actually legal and okay before it goes all the way through.
Absolutely. We wouldn't want to do anything illegal.
And we'll work with OP on that, and then again, bring anything back to the committee if needed in that regard.
Is there any objection from my colleagues? No? Okay. All right.
Then on page 8, Project 9, Energy Conservation, what you were just talking about, Mr. Rice, the college requests an increase of $875,000 for this project, with being $175,000 increase each year from 20 to 24. The college had requested the increase all in GEO bond funding, and then noted that the funding is needed to add a mechanical engineer position to implement the county's energy benchmarking laws. And there's 3 different pieces of legislation the council has passed, bills 214, 614, and 814 that all relate to energy conservation and green building and things like that they need a position to help them implement. The executive recommended 2 modifications. First was to reduce GEO bond funding by $75,000 in FY20, as was offered by the college for affordability. And then the second was to substitute current revenue for GEO bonds in FY20 to 24. And this again was the same issue that Mr. Harris had mentioned, to ensure that GEO bonds are only spent on something that it's eligible for. And council staff supports OMB's recommendation to use current revenue for that particular position. So it just keeps the same amount of money in there, just kind of flips the funding source. And to be able to keep that as current revenue was one of the reasons that we needed to change around the funding sources in the planning, design, and construction project.
Yeah, I just find it interesting, and again, that, we're going to have this, and I'm happy to see that the county executive supported this in terms of making sure that we're going to review new buildings and renovation designs for compliance, but then not have the money to actually make sure that the buildings comply. It's kind of nice to know that it's not complying, but to actually be able to do some of this stuff in terms of the renovations and the PLAR projects to make sure that you're adhering to it is also incredibly important, not just to say, well, you're not in compliance. So I support this, colleagues. Absolutely.
Then on project number 10, Germantown Student Services Center. And the college's request included the 4% cost escalation factor, as is allowed by the state, split 50-50 between county GO bonds and state aid. The executive's recommendation provides for this increase but shifts it into the beyond 6-year period to help with affordability, and the college does not oppose this change. And then the last project, which is a very short write-up for the amount of time that the committee has spent discussing this one. The college. Exactly. It's a much better spot than the past couple of years. But the college did request a 4% cost escalation factor, and the executive did recommend the college's request, and that was kind of helped out by some of the other changes that the college offered up as part of the process, and so council staff recommends approval.
And I see no objection from my colleagues, so I think that we are done. But I did just want to thank my colleagues because, again, in terms of importance, and we're going to really, and the council president has been a true leader on this when it comes to ensuring equity. We're going to have to start taking a very close look at a lot of the decisions that we make and how they impact people in our community. And so I think that, again, this is representative of what a direction for this council is going to be, and understanding who the people are who are most impacted by some of the budgetary decisions that we make are going to be, and making sure that those folks who we know continue to struggle. Dr. Pollard, I'm always struck by your story that you talk about in Chicago when you were growing up and how much libraries meant to you. Something that's stuck in my head, but it's something that's a constant reminder of what people look to for a lot of the county buildings that are utilized as places of refuge. There are a lot of people who use our county buildings as a whole for so many things beyond what we intend them to be used for. And so from that perspective, it really is one where we've got to make sure that we're recognizing that and the importance of that in their lives, and how we can best ensure that we're giving them a better resource than they would have at home, and making sure that we're stepping up to the plate when it comes to truly looking at an equity lens. So I just want to say thank you, because it's helped me to start thinking about this more intentional when it comes to a lot of the decisions that we make. Oftentimes we just think about things, we're so pressed and rushed in terms of what it is that we're doing, that we're not taking a step back to think about its impact. And so, this is nothing more than us talking about those people who are depending on us, who don't have a voice. That's why these decisions are being made. So I just wanted to say thank you.
I appreciate that comment, because what the work that we're all engaged in with this racial equity and social justice, process it's meant so that hopefully from now on, once we pass the legislation, then there'll be a culture change, right? I mean, it'll take a while. But then it will mean that we are not going to just look at numbers as numbers, that whoever sits in these seats and makes those decisions has to look at it from that perspective and that analysis of what does it mean. Because when we hear people say, well, let's say the college, the enrollment has gone down. So the logical response to that is, okay, well, if the enrollment is going down, of course we should reduce the ask, right? We shouldn't really, because the enrollment has gone down. But if you don't have then the data in front of you that continually shows who are the students that are taking advantage of this amazing opportunity and the difference that it's going to make in their lives, and how the county will then benefit from that. And the fact that then equity means that you don't just look at a number and say we're done. Equity means that you look at the opportunities and also some of the barriers that the students who are there now are experiencing, and how perhaps the resources that has been invested has not been enough to get them going. Then it shifts the conversation. And so that's what I'm really hoping happens. And again, it doesn't depend on who's sitting in these seats and who has a window into the lives of the folks that we're talking about. It means that by law, you are required to also put that analysis forward, so that when you're making the decision again, you're just not looking at something that seems logical, but as you peel back the onion, you realize that there is no logic here, especially if we want to achieve other goals. So it's very interesting, I think, how hopefully it'll play out, especially once we pass legislation, because then it would be you know, a requirement for us to look at it that way. But I really appreciate both, you know, Chairman Rice and Councilmember Jawando, who has come in sort of blazing the path for these conversations. But, you know, it's amazing because it is going to require an entire culture change of the way that we've done things, and it's really exciting.
Yeah.
So thank you for everything that you all do.
Councilmember Jawando. Councilmember Jawando, I don't think I heard you. Could you say that a little bit louder? No.
No, to all, it's great. I'm just happy to be here, and it's exciting. So, congrats, and looking forward to work with you. I know we have more difficult discussions to come, and but this is a good way to start.
All right, ladies
We'll
and
have them.
gentlemen, we're adjourned.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.